the largest country in the world. Back in the 1900s, the country didn't exist. In its place lay this, the Russian Empire, one of the biggest empires of that time. The empire was ruled by the Tsar of the Romanov family. The empire followed a system of government where one person held absolute power, the Tsar. But that did not last for long. Little did the Tsar know that an event as small as 4 people being fired from a factory in a corner of his empire would lead to him slowly losing his grip on his empire. It led to the setup of a body of elected members the Tsar had to consult. So what exactly happened in Russia that discredited the Tsar? What was Russia like under the Tsar? In the year 1914, the Russian Empire was ruled by Tsar Nicholas II of the Romanov family. The Russian Empire included current-day Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, parts of Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus. It stretched to the Pacific and comprised today's Central Asian states as well as Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The religion followed by the majority was Russian Orthodox Christianity, which had grown out of the Greek Orthodox Church. Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, and Buddhists were also present. But what was the economy and society like? Come, let's go take a look.
In the early 1900s, the Russian society consisted of the Tsar, nobles, factory workers, craftsmen, and agriculturalists. A large majority of the Russian population were agriculturalists. If we compare the proportion of the population to other countries of Europe, like France and Germany, Russia's proportion stands at 85%, while the other countries' proportion stands at 40% to 50%. Russia was a major exporter of grains. The cultivators of Russia produced grain for their own needs, the local market, as well as for export.
Majority of these lands, where the peasants grew their crops, were owned by the nobility, the crown, or the Orthodox Church. The peasants were deeply religious and respected the church very much. But peasants hardly had any respect for the nobles who owned the lands on which they cultivated. The nobles of Russia got their power and land through their services to the Tsar, not through local popularity. In Russia, the peasants wanted the lands of the nobles to be given to them. In protest, they would not pay the rent, and in some cases, they even murdered their landlords. These protests and murders took place quite frequently in South Russia in 1902. And by 1905, these incidents took place all over Russia. There was another point of difference between Russian peasants and other European peasants. The Russian peasants would periodically pool their land together and then divide it according to the needs of individual families. This division was done by the mir or commune. Apart from agriculture and farmlands, industries were also found in pockets across Russia. St. Petersburg and Moscow were 2 of the most prominent industrial areas. Most of the production in these industrial areas were done by craftsmen and joiners in their crafts workshop. They produced wooden spoons, baskets, toys, and even embroidery. In some regions, factories existed alongside these craft workshops. However, With the expansion of the railway lines in the 1890s, foreign investments in the industries increased, and soon more factories were set up. Coal production doubled, and iron and steel output quadrupled with the help of these factories. Soon, in some areas, the number of workers in the factories increased and was equal to the number of craftsmen. What do you think the working conditions of the factory workers and craftsmen were like?
Some of these factories collaborated with the craft units or workshops which were nearby. The craftsmen often worked for 15 hours a day, and a factory worker worked for 10 to 12 hours a day. Most of these factories were private properties of the industrialists. The government did supervise large factories to ensure minimum wages and limited working hours, but the factory inspectors ended up breaking those rules anyway. The workers were divided into different social groups. First was based on their location. Many of these workers had strong connections in the villages where they came from. Other workers had broken that connection from the villages and had settled permanently in cities, in bunkers, in dormitories like these. The second was the gender division. Not all factory workers were men. Women worked too. By 1914, women made up 31% of the workforce in the factories. But they were paid very less, equal to just half or a little more than half of what the men received. And the third division was based on skills. Metal workers were considered to be the superior set of workers, as their occupation demanded more training and skills. The division was seen in the way different workers dressed and in their mannerisms too. But despite all these divisions, workers united to call for a strike or stop work when there were disagreements with their employers. These disagreements were often regarding dismissals or working conditions, and strikes like these took place quite often. During 1896 and 1897, there were recurrent strikes in the textile industries, and during 1902 in the metal industries. The Russian working class slowly started to rise against their oppressive employers and the government.
With all the strikes and murders happening across the empire, it was obvious that the peasant and workers were not happy with the government and their Tsar. Slowly, their frustrations turned into a political wave that tried to change the way the government worked. But how were they going to go about doing that? Russia was an empire ruled by a king. Political parties were illegal. By 1898, the socialists who respected Marx's ideas founded the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party. But because of government policing, they were forced to operate as an illegal organization. They set up a newspaper, mobilized workers, and organized strikes. Whereas some other Russian socialists felt that the peasants who took up the customs of dividing land were the true socialists. According to them, the peasants and not the workers are the true socialists. They should be the ones behind the revolution. This way, Russia will become socialist quickly as compared to other countries. Hence, in 1900, the socialists of the countryside formed the Socialist Revolutionary Party. This party fought for peasants' rights. They also demanded that peasants should be given lands that belonged to the nobles. The Social Democrats disagreed with the socialist revolutionaries about the peasants. One of the members of the Social Democratic Party, Vladimir Lenin, felt that the peasants were not one united group. Some were rich, some were poor, some worked as laborers, and some were capitalists who employed others to work for them. Lenin pointed out that given such differentiation existed within peasants, they could not all be part of a socialist movement. But not everybody in his party, the Socialist Democrats, agreed with him. Lenin wanted a small, tightly organized, strictly disciplined party of full-time members who did what they were told in a repressive society of Tsarist Russia. Whereas the other faction of the party favored a large, loosely organized democratic party whose members could agree to differ on many points and to be open to everybody in the nation. The majority of the party were Bolsheviks and was led by Vladimir Lenin. And the minority of the party, the Mensheviks, were led by Julius Martov. The Social Democratic Party was divided over the strategy of the organization. Tensions were high in Russia. The Tsar was running a totally authoritarian government. In this form of government, all the power was concentrated in the hands of one single person, the Tsar. He was not subject to the actions of the parliament. The liberals of Russia campaigned to end this form of government. To add on, the year 1904 was a rough year for Russian workers. Prices of essential goods rose very quickly, and the real wages declined by 20%. For example, the prices of essential goods like bread, sugar, and butter went up, but the wages remained the same. Thus, the real wage, which reflects the quantities of goods which the wage will actually buy, declined. The workers found it really difficult to sustain. The people had no voice or real power. All they had was each other at the time. More and more people joined the workers' associations for support. And a certain incident in 1904 pushed the workers over the edge and Russia into revolution. In December of 1904, 4 workers at the Putilov Iron Works in St. Petersburg were fired. These 4 workers belonged to the Assembly of Russian Workers. The reasons were murky. The other workers requested for the 4 workers to be hired back, but the factory refused. Rage over the incident spread quickly. The rest of the Putilov workforce declared a strike in protest, and other factories followed suit. Over the next few days, over 110,000 workers in St. Petersburg went on strike. They demanded for a reduction in the working day to 8 hours, an increase in wages, and improvement in working conditions. Father Gapon led the procession of workers to the Winter Palace, the royal residence of the Russian Tsars in St. Petersburg. Upon reaching the palace, the peaceful procession was attacked by the police and the Cossacks. The Cossacks were an Orthodox Christian self-governing warrior organization that was loyal only to the Russian Tsar. Over 100 workers were killed and about 300 wounded. This massacre was known as Bloody Sunday, and it marked the beginning of the violent phase of the revolution of 1905. The immediate consequence of Bloody Sunday was a strike that spread throughout the country. The liberals, along with the Social Democrats and Socialist revolutionaries, worked together with peasants and workers to demand a constitution. They were supported in the empire by nationalists in Poland and also in Muslim-dominated areas by Jadidists. Jadidists are Muslim reformers within the Russian Empire. They wanted to reform Islam and modernize it. They then wanted this modernized Islam to lead their societies. Student bodies staged walkouts, because of which universities had to close down. They complained about the lack of civil liberties. Civil liberties are laws established for the good of the community, especially with regard to freedom of action and speech. Lawyers, doctors, engineers, and other middle-class workers established the Union of Unions and demanded a constituent assembly. And finally, as a result of the 1905 revolution, the Tsar allowed the creation of an elected but consultative parliament, which was called a Duma. But don't confuse the Duma coming up with the Tsar giving up power. Absolutely not. The Tsar still had the final say in the laws of the country. In fact, he dismissed the first Duma within 75 days and then re-elected the second Duma within 3 months. The first two Dumas were dominated by liberal and socialist opposition groups that demanded extensive reforms. Unsurprisingly, the Tsar neither liked anybody questioning his authority, nor did he want any reduction in his power. So, he dismissed the second Duma, changed the voting laws, and formed the third Duma. The third Duma consisted of conservative politicians, and this time, the liberals and revolutionaries were kept out. The Tsar also realized that the worker trade unions were getting more and more powerful. So to put a limit to the power of the workers, the Tsar made trade unions illegal. However, this did not stop the workers. The workers' committees and trade unions functioned unofficially. The political activities that followed the 1905 revolution formed the breeding grounds for the events that awaited Tsar Nicholas II.